Ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
Following the military action in Iraq, our government turned its eyes toward Syria and the possibility that they might also be developing weapons of mass destruction. Because of that, Gary and I would like to address the subject of Syria in Prophecy. In fact, Gary's written a neat article that appears in this month's magazine titled, "Let's Get Serious About Syria." Gary, fascinating study.
JR, and Syria is fascinating. Syria is in America's crosshairs right now. The famous Bush aircraft carrier speech said, in effect, after the Iraq conflict, if any of the rest of you terrorists want to stick up your ugly heads, we'll shoot them off. In other words, it was an ultimatum, and by the way, JR, I think it was directed at Syria. I'm holding here a May 2nd news release with a headline, "The U.S. has asked Syria to dismantle Hezbollah." And the United States demanded that Syria dismantled the militant Lebanese Shiite Muslim group called Hezbollah. It's one of the chief, if not the chief, terrorist groups in operation today, and JR, headquartered in Damascus and operating all the way over to the Mediterranean coast, and as we read in the headlines, harassing Israel continually. So I think we're wise to take a look at Syria.
According to Isaiah chapter 17, Damascus is going to be obliterated. We don't know exactly what type of weapon is going to be used for this, but we suspect nuclear. You see, when we went into Baghdad and our shock and awe type of military action against Baghdad was fascinating to see and awesome to behold. Nevertheless, it did not leave the city in a ruinous heap. According to Isaiah 17, the burden of Damascus, verse 1 says, "Behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap." So to me, Gary, it sounds like the United States is not going to pull the trigger on this particular problem. It could be Israel having to defend itself against weapons of mass destruction. Absolutely, and when we talk about a ruinous heap, we've got precision bombing now. Our Secretary of Defense, Rumsfeld, said that war has changed. He said, we no longer carpet bomb huge areas, we target specific locations with very, very focused charges. And we can take out leaders without taking out cities. But here, JR, the prophecy is that the city itself will be flattened to become a ruinous heap. It's been a city for over 4,000 years. The street called Straight that runs east and west through Damascus, and which, by the way, Paul used in his day, the Apostle Paul, is still a bustling thoroughfare to this very day. Damascus is a busy city. It's a commerce capital, a trade capital. Actually, if it weren't for Hezbollah and the Ba'athist party there, it would be a cultural capital as well. There's a lot to see and do in Syria. Now, according to Isaiah 17:4, the glory of Jacob shall be made thin, which sounds to me like, Gary, that Israel is going to be blamed for this destruction of the city of Damascus. Absolutely, and of course, isn't Israel always the scapegoat? You know, JR, this verse 2 of Isaiah 17 has an interesting clue, which we'll combine with some other prophecy in Jeremiah in a little bit, and to create a total picture. It says here, the cities of Aroer are forsaken. They shall be for flocks which shall lie down. None shall make them afraid. The region of Aroer is the region just south of Damascus that runs along the eastern side of the Jordan River all the way down to Amman, Jordan. And so not only is Damascus afflicted, but apparently all this territory to the south of Damascus. Yes, now in your article you wrote about the United States presence in Iraq and that Baghdad would be like the hub of a wheel. Explain.
Yeah, this is very interesting, JR, because what's happened is that the United States has, in effect, set up a provisional government in Damascus, which...
You mean in Baghdad?
In Baghdad, which has put them, pardon me, which has put them in an amazingly centralized location. If you look at a map of the Middle East, to the east of Baghdad, you have Iran. To the north of Baghdad, you have Syria and Turkey. To the west, you have Jordan. A little farther to the west is Egypt. And then to the south is Saudi Arabia. So here you have Iraq, Baghdad at the middle, and it's just exactly like the hub of a wheel. And all those spokes radiating out could be called vectors of power. And the United States is right in the middle of it all. And JR, I don't think this is accidental. I think it's been planned.
And I especially like the way you likened it unto a lion tamer.
Yeah, indeed. We are now like the old, like Clyde Beatty, the famous Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey lion. He walks in a cage of lions, and he stands right in the middle of all these lions that are perched up there just ready to eat him alive, and he takes a whip and a chair and he holds them all at bay. And that pretty much describes our position in Baghdad right now.
And throughout the Middle East.
Indeed.
In fact, even though we have won a wonderful victory there to relieve the people of Saddam Hussein's terrible regime over the past many years, but unfortunately, a lot of people there still don't like us. They don't appreciate what we've done for them. And in the other countries as well, this Islamic quest to rule the world is eventually, I think, going to break down in the Middle East. I feel that even though we've done a magnanimous thing, that we've done a wonderful thing to free the people and also to get rid of the terrorists in Afghanistan, eventually it's going to backfire. I hate to say that, but when I look at Bible prophecy, it looks like that everything in the Middle East is going to begin to shake out until a 7-year tribulation period will ensue, and eventually Armageddon will develop.
There may be a few moments of peace. There may be, shall we say, a hiatus, a pause of some sort while people regroup. But I agree with JR. Bible prophecy is very explicit, very clear. It says that the Middle East is eventually going to explode into a conflagration. Well, JR, Syria, as we look at Syria, modern Syria is sort of closed off. Hafez Assad, Bashar Assad, his son, are what you would call new Arab social democrats, very despotic rulers, socialist in philosophy, and they've kind of made a closed society out of Syria. But that was not always true in the past. In the past, Syria has been a major trade capital that it lay along what was called the Southern Silk Route. In which goods would come through the Persian Gulf all the way across the Fertile Crescent into Damascus and then down into Egypt. So Damascus has been a very busy trade city and something of a cultural capital during what's called the Golden Age of Arabia. And even before, back into the time of the Assyrian captivity, the 8th century, the 7th century. First you had the Assyrians that came in and took the land, and then after that, of course, you had the Babylonians, and then the Medo-Persians and the Greeks, who, in serial order, established rule over the city. But here's something fascinating to the modern mind, and that is we use the name Syria to describe this country. Actually, that's a Greek word. The real name of that country, the biblical name of the country, is Aramea. And the citizens there were Arameans. They were Semitic Gentiles who spoke the language called Aramaic. And JR, the great legacy of the Arameans back in the days following the Assyrian captivities, the Babylonian captivities. The great legacy of the Arameans was their language called Aramaic. Jesus even spoke Aramaic in his own day. That language spread out and it became sort of the trade language of the Middle East. And even up until the 19th century, people were still speaking Aramaic, and they referred to themselves as Arameans.
Mm-hmm. And back in Bible days also, there were the Nabateans who ruled from Damascus all the way to the south, mm-hmm. which included Petra.
Yeah.
And so they were a great empire of sorts, even in those days. Damascus then has been under the rule of several different cultures, mm-hmm. but by and large, it was a Semitic people and a Semitic language. That is, they came from Shem, the son of Noah, and that's also the same lineage or the same roots of the Jews. And so we have what appears to be brothers mm-hmm. and cousins, and at one time they were, you know, there have been pretty nice things one could say about the area. But the dark side is important to see, and we'll show you that when we return in just a moment. Around 333 to 323, somewhere in there, Alexander the Great conquered the world. He died in 323 in Babylon, and his kingdom was turned over to his 4 generals who divided it up into 4 different provinces. Seleucus took Babylon and Damascus and that part of the world, a pretty wide area. And thus began the Seleucid dynasty, which brings us down, Gary, to Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the very epitome of the Antichrist.
And as we mentioned a moment ago, the biblical name, and if you look it up in the Hebrew, the biblical name of the country we call Syria is Aramea. Well, when the Seleucids came along, they renamed the country, gave it a Greek name, which is Syria. To this day, it's called Syria, and it was named by Seleucus I in honor of himself. One thing can be said about the Seleucid dynasty: they were not ashamed to brag. They all thought they were, you know, the great conquerors, the great. They shone like the light of the sun. They all invented wonderful names for themselves, like Antiochus IV, who was 4th in line after Seleucus I, called himself Antiochus IV Epiphanes, which means the great and shining one in Greek. Now the Jews referred to him as Antiochus IV Epimanes, which is a little rhyming epithet. Epimanes in Greek means insane, which, by the way, I think he was.
Egomaniac.
He was an egomaniac.
Yeah. And so along about 168 BC, he had fooled many of the politicians in Jerusalem, and then came in with a mighty army.
Indeed.
They had, at first thought they were going to be able to get along with him. They should know better. By now, the Jews should know better. They can't get along with their enemies. And so Antiochus IV Epiphanes assaulted Jerusalem and committed the ultimate abomination of desolation, according to the rabbis. Mm-hmm. He sacrificed a female pig on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem, or a sow.
A sow.
But the fact that it was a pig is one bad thing, and the fact that it was a female pig, it makes it even doubly worse, doesn't it?
He knew how to grind salt in the wound. In 1 Maccabees 154, it says, on the 15th day of the month of Kislev in the year 167 BC, the abomination of desolation was set up on the altar. JR, the Maccabean histories actually use the term abomination of desolation. Well, you know where they got that term.
Yes, from Daniel.
They got it from Daniel.
That's right. In fact, they believed even in the 1st century that he was the Antichrist, mm-hmm. and that he had committed the abomination of desolation according to Daniel's prophecy.
To me, this adds a little note of interest to Jesus' discourse in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, because he referred to the abomination of desolation, and then he says, let those who have ears to hear understand. Let him that understandeth, you think, mull these things over. And no doubt, mm-hmm. fresh in the minds of the Jewish people at the time of Christ was Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
Yes. And so Jesus was actually saying what he did is a prophetic picture of the future Antichrist who will come in the last days and commit the abomination of desolation. Therefore, Christians, Christian theologians and Christians down through the centuries have made it a very plain and simple doctrine that there is coming a 7-year tribulation period yet in the future, and an Antichrist who is going to commit the abomination of desolation. And Revelation chapter 13 tells us about all of that.
Oh, indeed. Now, what's really historically important, and we must move along here, is the fact that the Seleucid dynasty continued for many, many generations, 13, 14, 15, and by the time you get down to 15, 16, you end up with the Seleucids intermarrying with the then dominant Romans. As it happened, the Seleucids became indebted to the Romans. The Romans, being firm and very pragmatic business people, knew how to take over a place, and they did it a lot of times financially as well as culturally. And the Roman Empire grew, the Seleucid dynasty began to shrink in influence, and the later descendants of the Seleucid dynasty started intermarrying with the royal houses of Rome. And by the time of Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and the other Caesars, there was an extremely close liaison between the Seleucids and the Caesars, which is fascinating historically.
Right. In fact, when you read the story of Nero's rise to power, you'll find that it was Seneca, a member of the royal Seleucid dynasty, a senator from Syria, who actually put forward Nero's name in the Roman Senate and schmoozed the people, you know, and talked them into behind the scenes diplomatic wrangling, got Nero appointed to the throne in Rome. And so the Seleucids, I think, had a very important part in that. Now, when Daniel comes along and talks about Syria and Antiochus Epiphanes and all of that, he is showing the roots of the Antichrist. So we have a prophecy in the Old Testament about that Syrian. And it looks like, you know, a lot of people have thought then that the Antichrist would come out of Syria. I think he will just simply be of the royal lineage of the Seleucid dynasty.
Absolutely, and I agree. The Seleucid dynasty disappeared through the royal houses of Rome and then on up into the royal houses of Europe during the days of the Holy Roman Empire. You know, Acts 11:26 says, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. That's in Syria. Syria became a very important Christian center, and then it became part of the Byzantine Empire. And of course, after the death of Muhammad, the Islamic people swept up through there, and by about AD 700, 720 or so, the Byzantine Empire was displaced by the Islamic Empire, which sort of brings us up to modern Syria. And modern Syria, JR, is fascinating for one thing. It's poised between two continents. The Europeans have always wanted to get a piece of Syria. In the modern era, Syria fell under French rule for a time, believe it or not, after 1922. And to this day, the French, the Germans, the British are trying to establish a foothold there. Why? Well, after the days of World War I, oil became very important. And it was noticed by the British and by the Russians at the same time that there was oil in that land. Well, the rest is recent history.
You know, you can have oil and ports in the Persian Gulf, but it's difficult to get it cheaply into Europe without an oil pipeline.
That's true.
In order to have an oil pipeline from those Arabian oil fields and Iraqi oil fields and Kuwaiti oil fields, you need this country called Syria to get over to the coast of the Mediterranean, make oil easier to supply. And so Syria is a vital part today of the mix. And I think, of course, it will continue to be. Russia presently has a 20-year peace treaty or defense treaty with Syria, and if Syria did get involved in a war with Israel, I think Russia then would have to come to the aid of Syria. Thus, the battle of Gog and Magog.
Indeed. Now, we tend to think of the contest between the Western powers as being kind of new, relatively new. Actually, it was at the turn of the 20th century, and then really following World War I, that Russia became really deeply interested in this area. To this very day, the Russians have a very strong influence with Hezbollah in Syria, Hezbollah being the terrorist organization that's headquartered in Damascus. But the British said, no, 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 you Russians are not going to get your hands exclusively on this oil. British Petroleum then rose as a major force in the Middle East. And the French, as I said a moment ago, after the Treaty of San Remo, the French actually were given Syria as a mandate, and they ruled Syria for a while. So, J.R., when we look at the European countries now, what we can see is the natural inheritance of modern global economics.
Jeremiah chapter 49, verses 23 through 27, concerning Damascus, Hamath is confounded in Arpad, for they have heard evil tidings. They are faint-hearted. There is sorrow on the sea. It cannot be quiet. Damascus is waxed feeble. This is day of the Lord stuff. This is Jeremiah's take on the destruction of Damascus as well.
Yes.
We'll be back in just a moment.